Hello, my American Studies 140 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. This is the week 5 lecture for the course, or for my summer 2020 students. This is the week 3 part 1 lecture for the course. This lecture really revolves around one Marion Barry, the mayor of D.C. for 4 terms between 1979 and 1999. He served 4 or 5 terms, 16 out of 20 years in D.C. But his influence goes further than that. In terms of his time in D.C. since the 1960s and up until his death in 2014. If you want to understand modern D.C. and some of the issues politically that have existed in this city since the 1970s, the best way to understand that is through one Marion Barry. And so I go over a lot of the biographical details of Marion Barry's life in the syllabus. How he was born in Mississippi in 1936, how his mom moved him and family to Memphis, Tennessee in the early 1940s to escape basically poverty and extreme poverty and the violence of the Jim Crow South to sort of a more or less upper South state like Memphis, Tennessee, where there's still violence, but not on the level that you would face in rural Mississippi, right? How he grew up there, how some of his consciousness got peaked when he was a teenager there, around, discrimination and, how the meritocracy doesn't really work for blacks, and so on and so forth. His education at a couple of HBCUs, and eventually earning a master's degree in chemistry, working on a PhD in chemistry before he decided to drop that and get involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, involved in Freedom Summer in 1964, and eventually becoming part and parcel of the overall civil rights movement and moving himself to D.C. in 1965. And there are lots of things to understand about Marion Barry here. The fact that a lot of things that he did even before he became mayor, when he was part of the city council between 1975 and 1979, when he was part of the school board between 1971 and 1975, when he was mayor of D.C., when he was on city council in the 2000s, in the early up until about 2010, I believe. All of it's always been focused around helping a city that was majority black, 70% black at the time he moved here in 1965, and anywhere between 50 and 70% African American in the years since, is to help really the city grow, particularly for blacks, in terms of work and then employment, in terms of providing public services, in terms of trying to make the city friendly and help the city pretty much recover from the 1968 riots and uprising, post MLK's death on April 4th, 1968. So that's sort of the main theme to understand here, that this man is a variety of contradictions. The general tendency among media, and quite frankly among some of my colleagues who teach on, urban American history, particularly modern urban American history, or in some cases teaching a course on D.C., the sensational aspects of Marion Barry, his drug addictions, him being caught on tape using the B word, or the bitch word, for those of you who don't know what the B word is, when the federal government ran the sting to catch him in the act of using drugs, in 1990, him serving 6-7 months in jail as a result of all that. right? The federal government, by the way, spent $53 million over a 4 or 5 year period to finally catch him in a sting at the Vista Hotel, which is a major hotel. At one point, it was, I think it's the Omni now, an Omni Hotel, but it's been DoubleTree Hotel. It's been a Wyndham Hotel over the years. I've actually stayed at this hotel and didn't know that I was staying in a room that Marion Barry would have been in at that point in the hotel. In my previous life as a nonprofit administrator for a program around social justice, hosting a conference there and happened to stay in one of the rooms. That might have been Marion Barry's room when he got caught. People tend to focus on those sensational aspects of things, when the reality is the main thing sure, he had a drug problem, but let's be honest, do we really think that every politician that's running a city or running a state or running the country hasn't had their own demons to deal with in terms of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, other things? This is modern era. I guarantee there are some. And what's really more important here is to understand the other contradictions with this man. The contradictions are actually important in understanding how DC evolved. As sensational as having someone as a mayor caught on tape, snorting coke, right? Having gin club or gin and tonic or whatever, right? Is nothing compared to what he tried to do and worked, and what he tried to do and didn't work during his time in office. And so let's focus on that, right? One of the main things he was able to get done immediately when he became mayor in 1979, after defeating Walter Washington in the primaries in 1978, was he implemented a summer youth employment program that's now named after him, that was based on the work that he was doing when he came to D.C. in the 1960s. He saw as employment as a way to stop the school-to-prison pipeline for African-American youth, and as a way to really reinvigorate the community by trying to give folks job training and the ability to find work after doing the summer work. And so D.C. took basically the guts of his nonprofit program that he founded in 1967 and made it part of their regular programming for the city. And basically 11,000 youth every single year since 1979 or more have been employed this way, right? But overall, what he did, particularly in his second and third term, was expand the size of D.C. government to employ people on works projects, on engineering projects, or construction projects, to try to reinvigorate the city, which had suffered through the 70s as a result of the 68 rise and uprising, white flight, and by the late 1970s, the emergence of black middle-class flight to PG County in particular, which is why PG County by the 1990s is a majority black county within the district. Within the DMV. So, not within the district, because it's a separate county and it's in Maryland. Anyway, so he's dealing with all of that. And in order to combat what's happening at the federal level, particularly around cuts to social services, cuts to social welfare programs, cuts in budgets, right? He basically has to bloat the budget in order to keep people working. In some cases, if you were to go through the Washington Post in the 1980s, there were well-known incidents of folks who are working some of these jobs where they're not really jobs. They're coming in literally to pick up a paycheck. Every 2 weeks they show up, pick up a paycheck, and then go on their way. That's literally what was happening in some cases. Again, this is sensationalized, right? There are people who are working jobs where they might not have a lot of work, but they still are working. And this takes the budget from a budget where they had a surplus to a budget that had deficits by the mid and late 1980s. But this is all part of Barry's plan to try to keep people working. So there's that. He also wanted to get more corporate investment in the city in order to build more housing, in order to bring more businesses in, and so on and so forth. And with mixed results. particularly after the mid-1980s, when his drug addiction does really have more of an impact in how he deals with people on the day-to-day, but also because, quite frankly, we still live in a racist society, right? And we live in this, and this is a racist country, and I think the last week has pointed out, or for those who are in my summer class, we're still seeing various signs of that racism in so many different shapes and forms. So that comes with the territory of trying to get folks to invest in a city that is majority black, where the poverty rate is higher than the nation's average, to be sure, but it's not particularly high. But it's not a rich city, right? The folks who are rich, or in the rich parts of town, live in wards 3 and wards 1, 3, and 4, right? They live in Northwest, right? They live in Georgetown, Tinleytown, Spring Valley. They live around the National Cathedral area. They live in Foxhall. That's where those folks are. They live in Adams, Oregon. They live Chevy Chase. They live in other parts of the city. They don't live in Columbia Heights. They don't live in Mount Pleasant. They don't live in Bloomingdale. They don't live in Trinidad. They don't live in Deanwood. And so trying to get those corporate entities to invest in Deanwood or invest in U Street Shaw or Detroit Park was difficult to, in fact, impossible in a lot of cases for them. So he did the only thing that any mayor would do, which is, if you build it, they will come. So during his time in office, he had the first Walter E. Washington Convention Center built around Gallery Place, around 9th and H Street, somewhere around there. So 7th and 9th H Street was that's when the first convention center was built, 1983, I believe. He also had built a municipal center on 14th and U Street, a general government municipal building where all the central social services of the city would be housed in one building. That was the plan, and that was finished, I believe, in 1986 or 88. So having those there attracts people to come to those places to do work, to do conventions, to work every day. And if you have D.C. employees, whether you live in Prince George's County, Maryland, or Montgomery County, Maryland, or in D.C. or in Arlington, showing up at these jobs, guess what they have to do? They have to eat lunch. They have to park somewhere. They have to spend money, right? And so that could contribute to D.C.'s coffers. It worked to some extent because, in point of fact, that holding that corner at 14th and U helped rebuild Shaw and helped attract some businesses on a smaller scale, particularly African black businesses in that period, right? And with the convention center, that did bring business into the heart of D.C., particularly around Gallery Place and the Metro Center District, which is basically downtown D.C. So that helped as well. But in general, there wasn't going to be a lot of investment as Marion Barry became more controversial between his trysts and affairs with other women that were open secrets in Washington. Between that and his drug addiction, which was becoming more and more obvious as he slurred words sometimes in speeches, would sweat more and all those other things. The corporate community was less and less likely to listen to his pleas for investment into the city. And then the federal government became involved heavily because D.C. was running hundreds of millions of dollars in deficits every year while bloating its budget to employ people. But then the crack epidemic hits D.C. in the late 80s, early 90s, and that turns a lot of what happens in D.C. to crap, right? That addiction takes hold in different parts of D.C. over the period of time between 88 and 92 in particular. It makes D.C. what's known as the murder capital of the U.S., as there are more murders here per capita than any city in the United States. Took over from Detroit, took over from New Orleans in the same period. There were years where there were 750 murders in D.C. Keep in mind that at the same time this is going on, New York's having 2,500 murders a year. That's a city of 8 million people versus a city of about 600,000 or 700,000 people. So you get kind of the scale there. So there's that part. So when he's finally arrested, sent to jail, et cetera, he's no longer mayor as of 1991. Sherrod Pratt Kelly takes over as mayor after that, and is and so takes over as mayor for a term. She finishes out his term, is elected to her own term in 1990, and runs the city for about 4.5 years. Marion Barry becomes a city council member for a couple of years. He actually wins that and runs for election in 94, and lo and behold, he wins because the federal government, in fact, is, for many people, railroaded him into serving jail time. Spending $54 million doing so in the process seems kind of excessive. So he wins re-election in 94 to the shock of so many Washingtonians. Federal government immediately moves to take over the D.C. budget. Congress passes an act in 95 to take over the budget of D.C. And it also passes an act in 96 to basically disempower the D.C. school board so that they, in fact, would have to compete with dollars with charter schools, which I'll talk about in another lecture, the next lecture recording that I do. Both of those weaken the power of the mayor. If you don't have, in the Act of 95 in particular, Congress gave itself line item veto power over any aspect of the D.C. budget. That means they could go through line by line and say, oh, we don't like this money for daycare centers, we'll take that out. Oh, we don't like this in terms of overtime for police, we'll take that out. Those kinds of things. And so that completely disempowered Marion Barry. Marion Barry realized after a couple of years of dealing with this, there is literally nothing I can do as mayor other than be mayor. And so there's no need for me to run for re-election if I cannot control the budget of the city. The irony is that the manager of the city's budget for Congress was one guy by the name of Anthony Williams, who eventually becomes the next mayor of D.C. after running for election in 1998. And when he becomes mayor, he gains more control of the budget. The Congress cedes some of control of the budget back to D.C. when he becomes mayor, giving him the power to do what Marion Barry couldn't. And because Anthony Williams was relatively squeaky clean, he could also do what Marion Barry couldn't, which was to go to corporate entities and say, this is a good time to invest in the city. Metro's a good thing. We've got this thing called Metro. This Metro rail system runs through the city. This will be good for workers. You can build businesses here. You can build new apartments here. You can build new housing here. Everything that Marion Barry had been trying to do since the 70s the city was ripe for by the late 90s with the investment dollars that were being generated from the internet age and the investment dollars that seemed more reasonable now that the city had a full-fledged subway system running through it. So that's the story of Marion Barry as mayor. But the impact that he had on the city lasts to this day, to this very day. How the city could basically see themselves as a city that, okay, it's majority black, but that means that this is our city, despite what Congress thinks, despite what the white community, white Washingtonians think. This is still our city. This is a black city. This is a city that has go-go and has things going for it, where the African-American middle class can still hold its head up high, where if you are working class, this is a city where you can work and feel like you're part of something bigger, those kinds of things. That's what Marion Barry was also about as part of his mayoralship. So he's a mixed bag. He's a contradiction. But don't get caught up in all the sensational aspects of this and generalize that he was just a drug addict or generalize that he was just a corrupt mayor. He was all of those things, and he was more than that. And so let's keep that in mind, too.